Why was Chuck allergic to electricity? Despite technically being in the same universe, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul differentiate themselves from each other through themes, writing, and characters. While Breaking Bad is for the most part a straight-up crime drama, Better Call Saul combines aspects of courtroom drama with crime. Drug dealers, junkies, and the mafias of the criminal underworld are juxtaposed with lawyers in suits. This legal side of the universe introduces new characters that bring color to Jimmy McGill's descent into criminal lawyer Saul Goodman. Out of all the characters that pushed Jimmy over the edge, his brother, Chuck McGill, arguably served as the foundation, upstarting Jimmy's transformation. Chuck himself is a character with a lot of layers. His motivations aren't always as straightforward as they may seem. As a character, Chuck stands out from the beginning due to his unusual condition. His claim of being allergic to electricity adds oddity to a fairly grounded show. What was the nature of this so-called allergy? Was Chuck lying about his condition? In this video, I'm going to analyze why exactly Chuck was allergic to electricity, and how that enables us to understand not only his character, but also his relationship with Jimmy. The root of Chuck's condition goes all the way back to his childhood. As siblings, Jimmy and Chuck's lives had always been intertwined. Compared to Jimmy, Chuck was always the high achiever. He finished high school at the young age of 14 and graduated university magna cum laude. However, he felt like his parents had always preferred Jimmy more. This jealousy ends up becoming the fundamental driving force of his EHS, or electromagnetic hypersensitivity, and much of his implicit attitude towards Jimmy. This jealousy is partly due to Chuck feeling like Jimmy never gets punished properly for the crimes he regularly committed since he was a kid. Not only did Jimmy get away with stealing money from his own parents, but Chuck also thought that his parents liked him better than they liked him. This would build up Chuck's resentment towards Jimmy. As adults, however, the two seem to get along better, at least on the surface. Early in the series, Chuck acted as some sort of conscience to Jimmy's faltering moral compass. He was there to remind Jimmy that his slippery attitude and disrespectful ways weren't acceptable. At this point, Jimmy appreciated this. He had been making unsuccessful attempts at becoming more honest as a person. Even on a personal note, Jimmy did try to be a good brother to Chuck, evident in his helping Chuck get through his wife leaving him. This, coincidentally, was also the moment that Chuck started to develop his EHS symptoms. The reason for this is going to be analyzed from two standpoints. The first standpoint looks into how EHS is integrated into the bigger plot of Better Call Saul and Jimmy's development as a character, while the second goes into an in-universe explanation as to how this condition comes to be what it means to Chuck and his identity. From the writing of the show, Chuck having EHS provides an expression of Jimmy's conscience and goodwill. Acting as a mentor and advisor, in the early seasons, Chuck was the thing that represented Jimmy's attempt at becoming a good person. Despite what Jimmy seemed like on the outside, he consistently yearned for Chuck's approval deep down. That was why he wanted a career in law as well. He wanted to be just like his older brother. As a new character, Chuck's important role was to reinforce the contrast between Better Call Saul's Jimmy McGill and Breaking Bad's Saul Goodman. The growing conflict between Jimmy and Chuck that happened as the series progressed directly mirrored Jimmy's gradual descent into his Saul persona. This is why it was all the more devastating when we later figured out that Chuck had been actively sabotaging Jimmy's attempt to be a good and honest lawyer. At that moment, Jimmy lost his reason to try to be a law-abiding citizen, putting the final nail in the coffin of any hope Jimmy had of redemption. This was how crucial Chuck and, by extension, his EHS was in relation to Jimmy's character arc and transformation. Furthermore, Chuck's EHS was also a way of making Chuck stand out as a character. While character development through trauma is definitely nothing new, a unique choice of this traumatic condition helps Chuck become a more memorable character among a cast of strong personalities, acting as an immediate and dynamic anchor to Chuck's character's introduction. The second perspective that needs analyzing is why Chuck developed this allergy to electricity in the first place. While there are several reasons, a simple observation allows us to form several surface-level conclusions about Chuck's EHS. First, Chuck's symptoms started appearing when his wife left him. Second, it got progressively worse as time went on, making him take more and more extreme precautions about it. Third, Jimmy pointed out that Chuck's symptoms seemingly worsened every time Chuck thought Jimmy was up to no good. Based on these observations, it's obvious there is an emotional element to Chuck's condition. In psychology, this condition is called psychosomatic. It is a type of physiological symptom, for example, a light fever or a coughing fit, that is caused entirely or partially by mental causes. When his wife left him, Chuck was devastated. It isn't entirely uncommon for people in conditions of extreme emotional distress to develop physical symptoms to go along with it. This might be a type of cry for help. It is a demand that the world pays more attention to you because you're hurting. However, Chuck did try to hide his condition from his wife, sealing his divorce by insisting to remain dishonest about his condition. As Chuck retreated further and further away from the real world due to having undergone a painful trauma, so did his condition progress, enabling him a solid excuse to regress inward in isolation. This notion is also reinforced by the fact that the intensity of his symptoms changes according to his perception of Jimmy. Every time Jimmy showed signs of doing something against his wishes, his symptoms would worsen in response. Here, the nature of Chuck's illness was made even more clear. The EHS was a manifestation of Chuck's mental anguish. Chuck's allergy to electricity was a coping mechanism. It gave him an excuse to whip out his space blanket and shield himself from the harsh realities of life. It was what he used to cope with the fact that his marriage was ruined, to cope with the fact that he had been self-absorbed and self-righteous, to cope with the fact that he secretly harbored resentment toward his younger brother. The EHS was Chuck's source of solace that allowed him to mediate all of these separate instances of pressure and stress. A natural question that rises from the aforementioned analysis would be the following. So, then, did Chuck fake the whole thing? If it was something Chuck used to cope, then doesn't that mean he did it to deliberately fool everyone around him in order to give him some space? However, this is actually quite unlikely to be the case. Despite its manifestation being something that is highly unusual, this way of coping is actually quite commonplace. It is a very human thing to have our coping mechanisms done unconsciously. As previously explained, it is entirely possible for someone to develop real physical symptoms in order to avoid doing something that the person wants to avoid doing. Chuck genuinely believed that he had EHS. Therefore, to an extent, the EHS Chuck had was real, in the sense that his body reacted as if electricity was actually harmful to it. The show strongly suggested that Chuck did not fake his illness. However, as had been previously elaborated, that doesn't mean the reasoning for his EHS was something unrelated to Chuck's mental state, like he would insist. This was why the reality of his illness only held so long as Chuck was aware of the electricity around him, as shown brilliantly by Jimmy through the battery he secretly planted on Chuck's person. Chuck was deluding himself. It was an especially potent delusion that was incredibly useful to him, despite harming him at the same time. This was why he held on to it for so long and was persistent in defending its validity. Better Call Saul explores new and colorful characters that would otherwise be absent from the Breaking Bad universe. It presents the brotherly bond of Chuck and Jimmy as an interesting, complicated dynamic facilitated by an unusual flavor. Chuck and his EHS showcases the fact that self-delusion is a powerful thing. It shapes us and gives us the power to shape reality itself. This delusion was what eventually led Chuck to his own demise, as he wasn't quite able to grasp that the thing that had become a big part of his identity was a lie he had so carefully kept from himself. As Chuck burned away in the comfort of his own home, maybe he wondered why he couldn't rediscover the strong footing he once had in broader society.